There is a broader global trend and a clear evolution in the role of HR within boards of directors.
HR is not responsible for whether a particular employee, such as Larisa Udovichenko, leaves or stays in a specific department. HR is responsible for supporting the execution of the business strategy and development. Whenever a company faces a crisis, my first recommendation is to take a close look at its culture and its HR function.
What does a board typically expect from someone with HR expertise?
A significant part of HR's responsibility is to inspire, build a compelling case, bring in experts, and ensure that strategic initiatives emerge within the company.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Boards of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel. Today we are joined by Alona Kavka. Alona, welcome. Today, Alona and I will discuss the evolving role of HR within boards of directors. Recently, including in international publications and research, there has been growing discussion about the increasing importance of HR on the boards of foreign companies. For example, 69% of directors stated that they expect their boards to devote greater attention to people-related issues. 30% of directors identified the Chief Human Resources Officer as the most valuable voice on the board after the CEO and CFO. In addition, 59% of respondents reported that HR leaders attend most or all board meetings, and so on. In fact, there are quite a few such references, and it is fair to say that this has become an established trend. It is clearly a global trend. In Ukraine, of course, under the current circumstances of a full-scale war, this issue carries even greater significance. Nevertheless, there is a broader global trend and a clear evolution in the role of HR within boards of directors.
Sergey, honestly, this information is genuinely encouraging. At the same time, I would very much like to see this trend reach Ukraine. It may also be linked to developments in Europe, including a directive adopted by the European Council. Under this directive, by 2027, companies operating in European markets and within the European Union will be required to implement certain measures and introduce pay transparency systems for their companies and employees. This initiative is primarily aimed at addressing gender inequality, as men around the world across virtually all countries, although the percentages vary, still tend to earn higher salaries than women for work of equal value, responsibility, complexity, and content. And first and foremost, this is connected to that issue. But what is the underlying foundation? What is it that all of these companies need to have in place? They need transparency not only regarding pay grades, but also regarding actual salary levels. I'm not entirely sure how this directive will ultimately be implemented, because as far as I know, European companies are not yet making significant preparations for it and are hoping that it will either not take effect or will not be fully enforced. Nevertheless, because of this, I also believe this is one of the reasons why the role of the HR director has become more prominent within companies, as some organizations are preparing and understand that this issue carries considerable risks. In reality, if salaries were simply disclosed overnight without preparing the company, preparing employees, and doing the necessary groundwork beforehand, it would create a very significant challenge for company leadership, which must determine how to implement such changes properly without losing employees. We also know that the labor market is experiencing difficulties across the globe. On the one hand, some companies are reducing headcount, implementing AI tools, or focusing on improving operational efficiency. They are redesigning their business models, which often results in substantial workforce reductions. At the same time, there are established professions, industries, and sectors where there is simply a critical shortage of workers. Today, people around the world are increasingly unwilling to work full-time, and they are less willing to invest their time and effort working for large corporations. As a result, companies are facing the challenge of both retaining talent and attracting new talent. This is why chief HR officers are finding a place on boards of directors. And that is a positive development. At the same time, I would say that unfortunately in Ukraine, this trend still persists to some extent. There are still cases where HR has no influence. There is also another side of the story where HR does influence the board, management, and the overall development of the company. But I can give you an example from a very simple story. If we talk about veterans, veteran-related practices, and the war in Ukraine more broadly, only 30% of companies in Ukraine have structured programs in place that are working with veterans and mobilized personnel. The remaining 70% do not have such programs. This is precisely where HR's role comes in, communicating the importance of these issues to owners, CEOs, and management teams. There are companies where the war is virtually absent, It is not reflected in their communications at all. And when you speak with colleagues, they say, yes, I understand its importance, but for our CEO, this is simply not a priority. This is especially relevant when we talk about culture. From time to time, I conduct training sessions on how to transform organizational culture and how to build it. Colleagues come to me seeking advice on how to make it happen. And there is always one question: how do I communicate that this is important? How do I properly convince the CEO? Because if there is no sponsorship from the top leader, there is little point in trying to implement these initiatives. They simply will not be successful. Culture will not transform itself simply because HR wants it to. There are really two dimensions to this issue. On the one hand, we may lack the right arguments or practical approaches to demonstrate why it matters. On the other hand, HR professionals often lack influence, and I believe the answer lies in our expertise, in continuously strengthening it, developing it, and expanding it. As HR professionals, and particularly when serving on supervisory or advisory boards, we must remember that we need a deep understanding of the business we work in. We need to understand that our function is a strategic one. It is not about carrying out what leaders have instructed or decided. Rather, it is about working alongside leadership to shape strategy and vision, being part of that group, and influencing the company's strategic direction. Because in reality, HR is not responsible for people. I would like to make a very important point. HR is responsible for creating the tools that help the company, its owners, executives, managers, and employees achieve the strategic objectives set before the organization. Therefore, the key issue is our own development as HR professionals, our expertise, our personal growth, and our awareness and understanding of the function itself. I believe this depends on us and will shape whether we earn a place on supervisory boards and become influential contributors in more companies, where a clear understanding of the HR function is essential. On the other hand, if a leader does not understand the value of the HR function and there is no realistic way to change that, then my advice would be not to work for that company. That is my personal view.
Yes, and the point you raised about veterans is particularly interesting. There is a growing body of research on the effectiveness of veterans serving on boards of directors, because indeed many of our colleagues are currently serving on the front line, and they will return with additional experience that could be highly valuable in a boardroom setting.
There was a conference yesterday and something was said there that stayed with me, something I had not previously considered in quite that way. Our colleague Ihor Kostenko, who works at Bank and leads the bank's veteran-related initiatives, is himself a veteran officer. He shared a very valuable and important perspective. Veterans are, in fact, one of the country's greatest strategic assets. They are essential to the nation's defense capability, and veteran-related practices are both company and national strategy. I completely agree with him on that point. We should also remember that every person is different. Being a veteran does not automatically make someone an ideal individual with a perfect set of competencies. But if we're talking strategically about the country's development and defense capability, as Ihor rightly pointed out, in many countries veteran affairs fall under the responsibility of the Ministry of Defense, because it is a matter of national policy and strategy. While we are still moving toward that model, at the company level we certainly need to recognize it. And it should absolutely be a foundational element of our strategies.
Returning to the reality of Ukrainian business owners, especially in small and medium-sized enterprises, they naturally measure everything through ROI, return on investment, or through other financial indicators, such as initiatives aimed at strengthening and improving corporate culture. What impact will this have over a given period of time? What value will a business continuity plan deliver over time? What value will a succession plan deliver over time? In your view, to what extent can these kinds of initiatives actually be translated into economic indicators?
Absolutely easily. Everything can be measured because any program we implement here can be assessed through budgets, productivity, and employee performance metrics. If we are talking about corporate culture, we can measure the impact of employee engagement, even on sales. Back in 2006 to 2007, as surprising as it may sound, we measured the performance of branch managers and bank tellers after implementing 2 to 3 month communication programs. These programs typically concluded with a major event and other related activities. We then measured their sales performance over the same period a year earlier, as well as with the following year. As a rule, those indicators improved. And we could see it in finances. When it comes to engagement, I know that consulting firms conduct research among their clients and clearly demonstrate how ROI changes, how return on invested capital changes, and how share value changes in companies that actively work on employee engagement versus those that do not. The same applies to training, and we can look at how effectively or ineffectively it is working. So in reality, it is clear that there are indicators that, for example, include problems or company revenue. One might say that HR contributed to that, but everyone contributed through the effective work of each function and department in the company. However, it is absolutely unfair to say that HR does not directly influence this indicator. I completely disagree with that, because it is clear that responsibility for payroll, budgets, and productivity can vary from company to company. In some companies, it is the responsibility of the HR director. In others, it is shared between the HR director and the COO. In some companies, business unit directors are responsible, while HR simply owns the budget and provides the necessary tools. Nevertheless, I believe that every function has a direct impact. Productivity and efficiency, all of this can absolutely be measured.
A further significant challenge frequently emerges when the business owner views HR as nothing more than a basic administrative service department that exists solely to assist with the management of personnel. And in that specific case, they really see a very minimal or negligible direct impact on the key economic indicators or the overall business results.
This is a shared responsibility, both HR and the CEO, in my view. In other words, you cannot simply say that the CEO is at fault and so on. I have always believed that you need to explain and demonstrate. Then if it still does not work, perhaps it is not worth investing resources into it. But first and foremost, HR today must understand that numbers, data, analytics, metrics, and managing through data is truly the key and the tool in the effectiveness of the HR function and of the dialogue. In many companies, there is a common situation where people say, that's HR. People left the company, so it's HR's fault. They failed to prevent it. Positions remain unfilled. It's HR. They're not hiring well enough. Our sales goals have not been met. That's HR. Didn't provide the training. And this is a challenge that the HR function always faces and suffers from. My recommendation and tool is analytics. It is a structured process with a clear division of responsibilities because HR can provide tools, build a system, create processes, post vacancies, establish a clear recruitment process, involve the hiring manager, and even train them to conduct interviews so candidates do not feel intimidated. But if you are the kind of manager people do not want to join or choose to leave, then yes, we can continue helping you improve. We can help you become a better manager, but we do not do the teaching ourselves. We create the tools and the system in which you can learn. So it is very important to separate these roles. It is also very important to have analytics so that the hiring manager has information on our standard time to fill, how long a vacancy can realistically remain open, what our benchmarks are, when we filled it, why we are unable to fill it, whether the salary is below market, why candidates are declining, and so on. That is why it is a powerful tool for building dialogue and for increasing respect for the function as a business partner. It is also very important to understand the business strategy and the business as a whole. Another principle is to treat the business as if it were your own. Some colleagues will probably tell me that it is just a job and that it is rarely appreciated. I understand that may be true in some cases, and perhaps it is simply part of my nature, but I am convinced that when you treat the business as your own and strive to do everything in the most effective and cost-efficient way, as if it were your company, it helps build trust and strengthen that partnership role where your colleagues in top management understand that the HR perspective matters and actively seek it out.
I have come across several cases where a company's top management effectively delegated their people management responsibilities to HR, including responsibility for managing people within their own teams. Even one-to-one meetings were delegated to HR, which is not typically an HR responsibility. And of course, this did not strengthen the role of that manager.
Handing responsibility over to someone else may seem convenient, but I encourage colleagues not to simply take it on. Instead, separate responsibilities. You do not have to say, "This is not my job, deal with it yourselves," but rather work together to understand how to support, train, guide, and ultimately transfer that responsibility back where it belongs. Because it is not HR's responsibility. HR cannot be responsible for every individual employee. In a company, HR should not even be expected to know that, because HR is not responsible for why a specific employee, such as Larisa Udovichenko, did or did not leave a particular department. HR is responsible for the company's turnover rate and for understanding the reasons behind it, where it is higher or lower, why that is the case, and how we should influence it. In essence, if I were to put it very briefly, HR is responsible for executing the business strategy and supporting the company's development by ensuring The right number of people with the right capabilities are in place at the right time while creating the foundation for productivity, growth, and a strong company culture. There is also a separate aspect related to company development and the advisory role of HR, assuming those competencies exist, a broader contribution to organizational development. If we are talking about internal boards, for example, HR can understand how to develop the company more strategically and may bring valuable perspectives on ESG and corporate governance, because these are also strategic tools that can help a company reach an entirely different level. But that is more of a next step.
And I think these perceptions are influenced in part by the fact that there are too few HR professionals who are willing to look at situations from a strategic perspective. There are too few HR experts who are board ready, who are prepared to take a strategic position and join a board.
I cannot speak in quantitative terms, but I certainly know many colleagues who are ready, who could do it, and who understand the business at that strategic level, and who could help drive development. They may not be building their own businesses, but this is certainly about partnership. I have spoken with some of them, and for example, they are no longer serving as HR directors today. In almost every case, when discussing why they left the corporate sector and what came next, the next step was either consulting or serving on supervisory boards. And why did they leave? Mostly, it comes down to values, point where my personal values no longer align with the company's values or vision. And the second situation is when the level of influence or the ability to influence is simply not sufficient. And here we are talking about mature HR professionals, not necessarily mature in age, although sometimes that is the case, but professionally mature, personally mature individuals who have developed their own perspective, understanding, expertise, and point of view. At that stage, they cannot simply execute a task because the CEO said so without question. They will voice their opinion, explain the risk to the company, and explain why something may not be the best course of action. And not everyone is comfortable with that. But in some cases, CEOs do listen, they hear those perspectives and act accordingly. I have had that experience myself, where you are heard and able to influence decisions. And that is wonderful. It works extremely well.
There are probably certain signs that indicate a company critically needs HR expertise on its board. What might those signs be?
I would say that any crisis within a company is a sign that the company needs to take a closer look at its culture. It needs to look at culture because culture is really about our management tools, our management approach, the way we interact and what we stand for. It is what we are about. So any crisis in a company would lead me first to recommend looking at the culture and the HR function. Is it effective? Is it strong enough? Because competition in the labor market today is immense. You can create a million strategies, but without a strong team and without a healthy, strong culture that supports that strategy, you will not be able to execute it. This is by no means a new idea. You can find it in the principles of spiral dynamics, and you can find it in the work of Ichakadizes, who argues that any crisis, any dysfunction within a company is first and foremost about culture and HR.
What does a board typically expect from someone with HR expertise?
It depends entirely on context. But in reality, if we're talking specifically about an HR-related request, it may sound unusual, but in my professional experience, it has always been about systematization. It has always been about roles, and it has always been about operational efficiency, about how well our structure aligns with the goals and objectives we have. It is definitely about efficiency, particularly operational efficiency in terms of workforce productivity. And it is definitely about those parts of the system that are meant to support the company. So if I had to describe it in one phrase, I would say it is always about consistency and structure. Then we move on to roles, organizational structure, the systems. In some companies, this involves working with a talent pool, with succession planning. In others, it involves compensation systems overall, including pay, benefits, and related areas. But fundamentally, it is always a request centered around systematization.
Very few companies have, for example, a clear authority matrix in place. And this creates significant challenges because there are constantly differing views on who should make decisions at which level and who should be responsible for initiating them. How much influence can HR have at the board level in helping address this issue?
I believe that in Ukraine, this is related to a broader context. This is my personal opinion, and others may disagree. We have a lot of changes. In general, we operate in an environment of constant transformation. As a result, companies keep evolving, business models change, approaches change, and roles change as well. In essence, even established businesses have been operating like startups during the wartime. We make decisions very quickly, and we adapt just as quickly. However, the concept of stable structures, defined roles, and formalized profiles is more applicable when business models and processes are already well established. That is when organizations can document RACI matrices, define roles, and create clear governance frameworks. Therefore, it is valuable for companies to establish at least a high-level structure. Whether it is a holding company or a standalone business, divisions should understand who approves what, where decisions are made, and who holds which authorities. For me, this is absolutely essential. It needs to exist because without it, organizations inevitably create more chaos. At a minimum, there should be clarity down to the N2 level and across functions, with a clear understanding of roles and responsibilities. This helps avoid duplication of effort and clarifies who initiates activities. For example, if a company operates across multiple countries and we are discussing marketing, it should be clear who develops the marketing strategy, who initiates it, who provides the necessary input, and who is responsible for execution. That level of clarity is essential. But when it comes to having every role matrix explicitly written out, that's a much bigger undertaking, and realistically, businesses must invest considerable time and resources into it. If we spend 6 months documenting business processes down to the 4th level of detail for a single function, only to fundamentally change the business shortly afterward, the value of that effort becomes questionable. Therefore, it is important to apply sound judgment and identify which roles and processes truly need to be defined and at what level of detail. Organizations must recognize that some aspects will need to be managed and adapted. Fundamentally, however, there should be clear definitions of the roles of the board, the CEO, functional leaders, and in larger organizations, the key functional areas. It's important to have a roadmap for documenting additional processes, digitizing them over time, and building a more systematic organization, one that can continue operating with the agility of a startup while steadily increasing structure and discipline. But I understand the context.
This creates a very interesting effect because as a result of our situation and the full-scale war, we are forced to be extremely flexible. In reality, we take best practices that work in stable markets and adapt them to our circumstances. We make them work in a way that does not compromise our agility. Instead, they support resilience and sustainable development, even under the conditions we are facing today.
100%. In addition to flexibility, we must make decisions quickly, respond rapidly, and have multiple contingency plans in place, including risk matrices for virtually every scenario that could arise. We have to think several steps ahead and maintain crisis response measures across all areas of the business. At the same time, we need to preserve our energy and capacity, especially as top management, board members, and CEOs. So there are many challenges, but it's also rewarding. I believe that very few people other than Ukrainians could have done this. I am proud of that, and I recognize that it makes us unique. It is not a path we chose for ourselves, but it has provided an extraordinary experience.
What role can HR play in strengthening resilience, business continuity planning, BCP, and related areas like crisis preparedness and workforce stability?
Sergiy, this is an interesting question because HR has probably been the most burned out function over the past 2 years. HR teams have carried an enormous workload, and we are still learning because so much falls on HR: relocations, evacuations, employee well-being, and psychological support. No matter how much we talk about sharing responsibility with managers, the reality is that we have teams, top management, and countless complex issues that we continue to address every single day. Right now, I believe this is a real challenge. But at the same time, as an HR community, and certainly among my colleagues too, we have spent at least the past year focusing first and foremost on ourselves. We are working on our own resilience and capacity, and I believe that this enables us to build resilience more effectively within our organizations. Supporting people through uncertainty has always been part of our responsibility, but the war has amplified that responsibility significantly. Today, our primary challenge is ourselves because for a long time, we did not put on our own oxygen mask first.
What HR strategies can be particularly useful in times like these?
One thing I can say with confidence is that if your company does not have a development strategy or does not have a strategy at all, then the best HR strategy is to help the company create one. Only after that can HR build its own strategy, provide a realistic view of the labor market, present at least an approximate roadmap for the company, and determine how the HR strategy aligns with and supports the broader business strategy. That first step, helping establish a strategy, is absolutely essential. Because the reality is that there are still companies. I understand the argument that the market is uncertain and that planning feels difficult under current conditions. However, if we do not plan at all and remain solely in survival mode, then survival mode becomes our permanent state. So in my view, HR has a major responsibility to inspire, guide, demonstrate, advocate, build a compelling case, bring in experts, and ultimately help ensure that the company develops a strategy.
Alona, if we compare companies where the board includes an HR expert with companies where the board includes, for example, a CEO who also has some HR expertise, what are the key differences between those companies? How do their approaches to work differ and perhaps the decisions made by the board?
A lot depends on the CEO's background and experience. You mean an executive or operating leader who is responsible for the HR function, am I right?
What I mean is the difference between companies where the board includes an HR specialist and companies where the board includes someone with CEO experience who also has an understanding of HR.
In general, the best results come when a specific function and a specific outcome are entrusted to an expert who deeply understands how the system works, knows which tools can be applied, and can communicate with the target audience in its own language. For example, if we are talking about an operations director, that person typically knows how to communicate effectively with production teams, factory managers, and plant directors in terms they understand. And they also have a deep understanding of production processes and ideally know how to improve operational efficiency as well as how to reduce costs and increase value. The same principle applies to HR. There is often a misconception that HR is simple and straightforward, that there is not much to learn. People assume they can watch a few YouTube videos, see what other companies are doing, and simply replicate those practices. In reality, it does not work that way. Becoming a strong HR professional requires significant personal development, experience across different organizations, and extensive testing of how various tools perform in different situations. In many ways, you are constantly working with uncertainty because you never know which hypothesis or approach will be successful this time. And when a production director says something like, "What do you mean? How can it be that I won't have 50 people in 5 days?" How's that? There is a hiring request, there is a process in place, so people should be starting within 5 days. But people are not manufactured products that can simply be delivered within 5 days. You may have the required headcount request, 2 recruiters assigned to the process, and all the recruitment tools activated because HR works through HR tools and processes. HR works with the maturity of the organization, with the leaders it has, and with the internal clients it serves. HR also works with employees and with the labor market, as well as the broader global context in which the business operates. The challenge for HR is to bring all of these elements together and develop solutions every day that are grounded in evidence, deliver results, and create value for the business. That's why it's not enough to say that any can be responsible for people-related matters. By the same logic, an HR professional could also take responsibility for the role of an operations director. If an HR professional deeply understands the business processes and the organization itself, they will absolutely identify opportunities for optimization and value creation. However, this is similar to medicine. A surgeon's effectiveness comes not only from understanding the tools, but also from having an intuitive sense of what the patient needs and when. The same principle applies to business. I can recognize that a particular executive is the person the organization needs. I may not yet know the specific role, and I may not even fully understand the future strategy, but I can see that this person will fit. So I do everything I can to bring that candidate into the company and make the case that we need them. And then, 2 weeks later, it becomes clear that they are exactly the right fit for an opportunity or challenge that even the HR director had not anticipated. That is what business intuition is about, an understanding and instinct that cannot always be fully explained through a purely scientific framework. It reminds me of a well-known story, which I believe is associated with the Ford plant. A specialist was called in to fix a piece of equipment that had stopped working, and he said, the job will cost $10,000. He spent 2 days observing the machine and then said, hit it twice with a hammer on this side. They did so, and it worked. Then they asked him, could you provide an itemized invoice explaining why this cost $10,000? He replied, yes, of course. $2 for the pencil I used to make the mark, and $9,998 for knowing where to place it. In many ways, that is actually what HR is about. HR is not something that can be learned through a standard educational path, at least not in Ukraine. It is not like becoming a marketer or an engineer by completing a university program. Much of it comes from experience, judgment, and continuous learning. It is such a multidisciplinary field that it draws on knowledge from many areas, and you need to understand processes, technology, engineering, and much more. So I could talk about this for a long time. I am convinced that it is never as effective when the role is filled by someone without HR expertise.
Could you give examples of questions that a CFO or another executive without HR expertise might not ask, but that someone with HR expertise at the board level would?
I believe those questions are primarily about team effectiveness, team maturity, collaboration, and development. If we are talking about the CEO, they are also about leadership effectiveness and interpersonal dynamics. Because if we talk about what happened in my experience, colleagues from other functions can discuss these topics, but they do not assess them through a professional HR lens. For example, during a board meeting where the CFO was presenting, an HR professional is constantly and professionally evaluating the organization. Simply by participating in meetings, they are effectively conducting an ongoing audit of expertise, competencies, strategic alignment, team dynamics, organizational capability, interpersonal relationships, potential conflicts, and the mechanisms in place to resolve them. This is particularly important when dealing with sensitive issues that require facilitation, such as disagreements between shareholders. In those situations, if there is sufficient trust and credibility, the chair of the board can certainly play an important role, especially when responsible for strategy and overall business performance. However, a strong HR director can be an exceptionally valuable partner in those discussions.
Taking into account what we discussed at the beginning of our conversation, namely the research being conducted in different countries right now, which shows that there is a certain evolution in the role of HR on boards of directors, how sustainable do you see this trend? Is there really a continuous movement and a certain tendency in this direction?
I believe the trend is real. The war may have slowed this development to some extent, but I think the opposite effect is beginning to emerge. We all believe that the war will end. Even now, while we are still in this process, many companies and investors are considering Ukraine as a place to build businesses and make investments. Naturally, for public companies, financial institutions, and especially state-owned enterprises, governance requirements are often driven by legislation. In fact, as far as I know, Ukrainian legislation has already evolved and now includes stronger corporate governance requirements. If we are talking about private companies, this is more about growth, expansion into new markets, access to capital, and long-term development opportunities. Therefore, I believe that the natural evolution of both private and state-owned enterprises will increasingly require the implementation of corporate governance practices and, consequently, supervisory boards. I also see this as a significant opportunity for professionals across different disciplines and for senior managers in Ukraine to develop their expertise and be prepared when this demand accelerates. Because it is entirely possible that if the share of companies with supervisory boards were to increase from, say, 5% to 15% within a year, we would suddenly need a very large number of qualified experts, and those positions will not be filled exclusively by internationally appointed board members. Yes, on the one hand, it's not the right approach, and on the other hand, it is quite expensive. Not every company will be able to implement it. And thirdly, it is probably more appropriate when supervisory boards also include Ukrainian professionals.
Absolutely. Alona, if we look at the current situation and the growing demand for HR expertise at the board level, it seems that in Ukraine, this demand is driven by two factors, a global trend and a local factor related to the war. How do you see the evolution of the HR role on boards developing after the war ends?
The reality is that there is currently a significant shortage of strong, effective HR directors and HR professionals in the market. Compensation levels are rising noticeably, and the talent supply remains insufficient. This is because there are not enough qualified candidates available. Another reason is that some professionals have moved abroad, and we do not know how many of our colleagues will return. Those who do may bring valuable international experience with them. That would be a positive development because it would enrich both the HR profession and the labor market with new knowledge. At the same time, I see this as a reflection of a broader reality. If the market lacks enough highly capable HR professionals for large companies and mid-sized businesses, then we can expect a similar shortage when it comes to supervisory boards.
Alona, thank you very much for joining our program. Thank you for your insights, recommendations, and valuable perspectives. Hopefully this trend and the continued evolution of the HR role on boards of directors will continue after Ukraine's victory as well.
Yes, Sergey, thank you for the invitation. I believe in this future because the HR market in Ukraine is strong, and I believe we have the expertise to contribute value to organizations and markets around the world. But I want it to be in our own country, so we keep developing, growing, and helping each other.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us on the channel Boards of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin. See you in new episodes.